"You need to step off this flight, ma'am." The airport buzzed with the usual sounds of rolling luggage, loudspeaker announcements, and travelers rushing in all directions, but Amira moved through it all with quiet determination, her chest tight with excitement and nerves. She was dressed modestly in a grey hoodie, clean jeans and sneakers. Nothing flashy, but her presence turned heads as she walked toward the boarding gate for Flight 722 bound for Washington, D.C. She clutched her leather bag close, a birthday gift from her father, a man she hadn't seen in 6 years, and today she was finally going to surprise him. She had worked 3 jobs to save for this trip. She had booked first class not because she was rich, but because she wanted to experience what it felt like to sit where no one expected her to sit. She had earned it. She had planned every second of this day, and nothing, not even the stairs, not even the long silence from the gate agent when she handed over her ticket, would ruin this moment, or so she thought. As she stepped into the aircraft cabin, the scent of fresh leather seats and recycled air hit her. The flight attendant at the front gave a brief nod, but her eyes lingered a little too long. Amira smiled politely and moved toward her seat to her right next to the cockpit door. The man in 1A, a balding white businessman, glanced up from his tablet, frowned at her, then returned to his screen, as if her presence were a glitch in his universe. Amira slid into her seat, pulled out her phone and took a breath. She wasn't used to luxury, but she was trying not to shrink, not to fold into herself, as if apologizing for simply existing in this space. Then something shifted. The flight attendant leaned slightly into the cockpit, whispered something to the pilot, who emerged a few moments later with a furrowed brow. He looked down at her boarding pass again, then looked at Amira. He was tall, broad, and had the sort of face that never smiled. He stepped forward with a strange kind of authority, like someone used to being obeyed. Without question, his voice was cold and direct. "Excuse me, ma'am, I need you to step off the plane." Amira blinked once, unsure if she heard him right. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but steady. "There's been an issue with your ticket. You need to step off now," the pilot said louder this time, and several passengers looked up. The businessman in 1A raised an eyebrow, and the woman in 3B paused her conversation to listen more closely. "My ticket is valid," Amira said slowly. "I'm in seat 2A. I checked in properly." "I don't care," the pilot said. "You are not flying on this plane. I won't take off with you on board there." It was not even a mask of civility, just a direct, unfiltered truth. And it struck her like ice water, not because it was new, but because it was so familiar. The coded language, the veiled accusations, the security risk nonsense. She had lived with this her whole life, and yet it still stunned her. "Every time you think I'm a threat?" Amira asked, and the plane fell into silence. Even the crying baby in the back quieted as if sensing something serious. The pilot didn't answer, but his silence was louder than any accusation. "Sir," a man from further back said, "she hasn't done anything. This doesn't seem right." The pilot shot him a glare and turned back to Amira. "Either you get off voluntarily, or I'll call security and have you removed." Tears burned at the edge of her eyes, not because she was afraid, but because this moment was so cruel. She had waited for years to see her father again, to show him the woman she had become, to prove that she had risen beyond every stereotype, and now she was being treated like a criminal in front of strangers, with cameras recording her humiliation. "Let me call someone," she said quietly, her voice cracking. The pilot sneered. "Fine, make it quick." She unlocked her phone, scrolled to the contact labeled Dad, and pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then connected. Mirror came, the deep, warm voice on the other end. "What's wrong? You're calling earlier than expected, Dad," she whispered. "They're trying to kick me off the plane. They say I'm a security risk." "Squat," came the voice, sharp and alert. "Who said that?" The pilot, she said, barely able to hold back the flood. "I don't know what to do. Put me on speaker," he said instantly, and Amira did. "This is Director Alan Thomas of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The voice boomed from her phone, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "I want the full name and identification of the pilot who just attempted to remove my daughter from a federally approved commercial flight." The reaction was immediate. The flight attendant gasped, and the businessman in 1A straightened in his seat. Even the pilot flinched slightly, as if someone had punched the air from his lungs. "Sir," the attendant stammered, "I didn't know she was I." "Don't care who you thought she was," the voice thundered. "You targeted a passenger with no provocation. You violated federal anti-discrimination laws, and you just made a very serious mistake." Kimura looked at the pilot, who was now pale and visibly shaken, but still trying to hold on to a thought. "You can't prove anything," he muttered. "Actually, we can." The voice said calmly, "This call is being recorded, and I have already alerted Homeland Security and your airline's internal affairs team. If my daughter is not allowed to remain in her rightful seat and treated with the same respect as every other passenger, I will make sure your career ends today." More gasps echoed across the cabin. Someone clapped in the back, and others began murmuring in support. Amira, still standing now, watched as the power in the room shifted entirely. The same people who moments ago had stayed silent were now watching the pilot like vultures circling a wounded deer. Pilot opened his mouth, then closed it, then turned around and walked stiffly back into the cockpit. The flight attendant quickly approached Amira, her tone now dripping with panic and forced politeness. "Please, ma'am, we are so sorry about the misunderstanding. Would you like anything to drink while we prepare for departure?" Amira said nothing. She sat back down, her spine straight, and her eyes locked on the closed cockpit door. She felt nothing at first, just cold. Then slowly a fire began to burn in her chest. Not just anger, but the weight of 1,000 other moments like this. Every microaggression, every insult, every sideways glance, it all came rushing back. But this time she had not stayed silent. This time she had backed up. The passengers around her began murmuring again. Someone leaned in to say, "You handled that with so much grace." Someone else said, "You shouldn't have had to deal with this at all," and Amira nodded politely, but inside she was still vibrating from the shock. The gate agent came on board, whispered something to the flight attendant, and then left as the aircraft doors closed. Amira finally exhaled. She pressed her phone close to her chest like a shield. Her father was still on the line. "You okay, baby?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Thank you. You don't ever have to thank me for protecting you," he said. "Just remember who you are, and don't let anyone shrink." "Why won't she?" whispered. The plane began to taxi, and Amira looked out the window as the runway rolled into view. She thought about everything that had just happened, about how quickly things can turn, how fast people can try to erase you, and how powerful truth becomes when it's spoken out loud, especially when backed by a voice the world cannot ignore. But the pilot inside that cockpit was not done yet, and as the plane lifted off into the sky, something about the way he gripped the controls, something about the cold flicker in his eyes, suggested that this story was far from over. The pilot's grudge runs deeper than she knew. Amira sat in her first-class seat, her body still tense, her fingers clenched around her phone screen. Though the call had ended, her father's voice echoed in her chest like armor. But even with the fire of justice burning in her blood, there was something about the silence that followed which unsettled her. The cabin had gone oddly still. The crew moved carefully with fake smiles. The pilot had not returned to address the passengers, and that was strange. She knew from her past flights that pilots usually greeted first class and gave cheerful announcements, but this one had vanished into the cockpit without a word, and her instincts whispered that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The woman beside her leaned in and said, "You're incredibly brave. I can't believe what he tried to do. That was disgusting." Amira nodded, but kept her eyes on the cockpit door. Something about the way the pilot had stared at her burned into her memory. His eyes hadn't just been judgmental, they were filled with something darker, not just bias but personal hate, as if she had done something to him in another life, or maybe he recognized her from somewhere. Maybe this wasn't random at all. The flight climbed through the clouds and leveled off into cruising altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign turned off, and the flight attendants began moving around, offering drinks and snacks. The tension began to melt from the air for everyone except Amira. She kept thinking about that name on his badge, Captain R. Riker. That name scratched something in the back of her mind. She opened her phone, turned off airplane mode, just for a moment, and typed in his name. R. Riker. Pilot racist complaint, and her screen lit up there. It was a string of past complaints, some buried, some removed, some archived by watch groups. Reports of him targeting women of color, especially black women, quietly removed from flights. False claims of behavior issues, accusations swept under the rug by the airline, and NDAs that shut people up before lawyers ever got involved. Amira's heart pounded faster, her pulse loud in her ears. This wasn't just about her. This man had a pattern, and he had gotten away with it for years. But this time he had picked the wrong daughter. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened slightly, and the co-pilot stepped out to use the lavatory. Amira caught a glimpse inside and saw Riker hunched forward in the seat, hands on the controls, his mouth moving as if muttering to himself. She couldn't hear the words, but his face was twisted the way someone looks when they're reliving something painful or consumed by rage. The door shut again as the co-pilot returned, and Amira's stomach twisted. The flight attendant approached. "Would you like anything to drink, ma'am?" she asked politely. Amira stared at her and said, "Is your pilot okay?" The attendant blinked. I assume so. Why?" she asked. Amira leaned forward. "Because he has multiple public complaints of racial discrimination and tried to remove me without cause, and now he's flying a jet full of passengers in complete silence. Do you not think that's strange?" The attendant's smile dropped completely, and she lowered her voice. "I'll check with the captain. I promise, ma'am, we'll take this seriously." She walked away, but Amira didn't feel better. She turned to the woman beside her. "Do you think he'd do something irrational? That man gives me the creeps," the woman said. "He looked like he wanted to throw you into the ocean. I wouldn't trust him with a paper plane, let alone this." Amira glanced around, saw more people relaxing, scrolling on phones, some already sleeping. They had no idea that the man flying them had a history of hate in his hands, and possibly revenge brewing behind that locked cockpit door. And then she remembered something her father had said years ago about enemies hiding in uniforms, and how the most dangerous ones didn't scream, they smiled and held power. She pulled out her notebook and began writing down everything: badge number, flight number, gate time, boarding crew, names, passenger seat, witnesses, anything she could recall, because if anything happened, she wanted it documented. But as she wrote, her phone buzzed with a message from a blocked number. "I warned you not to get on this flight." Her heart froze. The message made no sense unless someone on board had sent it. She looked around, her breath caught in her throat. The woman beside her leaned over, saw the screen and whispered, "You need to show that to someone." She rushed to the back where a senior flight attendant stood by the galley. She showed her the message. The woman frowned. "Did anyone threaten you before this?" Amira said. "Just your captain." The attendant's face changed completely. "Follow me," she said quickly, "and lead Amira to a jump seat near the back, away from other passengers. "Stay here," she said, then pulled out a small radio and spoke into it quietly, her tone sharp and urgent. A few minutes later, she returned with the crew supervisor, who reviewed the message and nodded grimly. "We're going to monitor this closely," he said. "Please stay calm. We're not going to let anyone harm you or this flight." But Amira could feel the shift. She had stepped into something deeper than she understood. She returned to her seat, where now 3 passengers whispered in worry. "Something's off," a man said. "I saw the pilot staring at the cabin camera. Just staring, not even blinking." And another woman said, "I heard him whispering over the intercom, but it didn't go through. It was like he was talking to himself." Amira gripped her seat, the image of a man spiraling, unraveling behind locked doors, flying a jet filled with people he might see as enemies or tools, or nothing at all. Suddenly a soft ding came over the speaker. The pilot's voice crackled out, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a technical fault, we will be slightly altering our route for safety. Thank you for your patience." The flight map on the screens changed slightly. They were still heading east, but the route now dipped south over less traffic, less radio coverage. Amira knew enough to know something was wrong. She stood up and moved toward the flight attendant. "I need to speak to the co-pilot," she said. "I have reason to believe something dangerous is going on." The attendant hesitated but then nodded and led her forward. The cockpit door opened after a knock. The co-pilot stepped out, and the moment their eyes met, Amira knew he recognized her, not from media, but from her father's picture. The co-pilot said, in a low voice, "I know who you are, I know who your father is, and I need you to know, I am not part of this, whatever the captain is planning. It's not Amira's voice shook. "What is he planning?" The co-pilot swallowed hard. "He changed the route without protocol. He says it's because of turbulence, but we both know that's a lie. He keeps saying things like, 'This ends today, I'm reporting it, but I'm locked out of the system. Only the captain has control right now. You need to take control back," Amira said, and the co-pilot looked helpless. "I will try," he said, "but if something happens, you need to be ready." "I can't say more." The door shut, and Amira stumbled back to her seat, barely able to breathe. The woman beside her asked what happened, and Amira just said, "We might be in danger. That's all you need to know." The cabin lights dimmed for night mode, and Amira sat frozen, her phone in her lap, her hands shaking, her mind racing. The pilot had a plan, and it involved her and this aircraft and maybe vengeance. She didn't understand yet, but she wasn't helpless. Not anymore. She reached out to her father again, typed a quick message, told him what the co-pilot said, shared the new route and GPS info, and then she waited, eyes on the cockpit, knowing this flight was now more than just a trip. It was a trap, and she was at the center of it. Altitude of secrets. The cabin remained dim and quiet as the aircraft glided through the night sky, but inside Amira's mind everything was noise, flashing warning lights, shadows of past trauma crashing into present fear. Her fingers hovered over her phone, unsure if she should send another message to her father, unsure if the signal would hold long enough, unsure if she was being watched. The air was heavy now, not just with recycled pressure, but with something unspoken, something unnatural, as if everyone subconsciously felt it, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Her eyes kept drifting to the cockpit door, which remained sealed tight. Like a vault, she wondered what the pilot was doing on the other side of it, whispering, planning, replaying whatever ghosts haunted his soul, because it was clear now that this wasn't just a case of racism, it wasn't just bias or ignorance. Something more personal was twisting inside that man, something connected to her, maybe even to her father, and whatever it was, she could feel it crawling closer with every mile they flew. She glanced at the screen in front of her, showing their route. It had been altered again, now dipping far south of their intended course, flying over a region with little air traffic, no city lights below, only endless darkness like a void. And she knew from her father's teachings, from stories whispered across dinner tables, that when someone in power chooses silence, it often means they believe no one will hear. The scream. Samira stood up, walked quietly toward the galley in the back, where the same senior flight attendant stood, her eyes wide and worried, as if she too had seen the route change. She whispered, "You see it too, don't you? He's not flying the path anymore." The flight attendant nodded, barely. "Yes, and we can't override him. The crew systems have been locked down. He changed the command codes. That's never supposed to happen unless we're under hijack conditions, which we aren't, not officially at least." "Then we need to make it official," Amira said. "You have to alert ground control." "We tried," she replied. "The signal is weak. He's rerouting it, or jamming it somehow. I don't know how. I just know we're flying blind and no one's coming unless someone on this plane makes them come." Amira's heart pounded. She returned to her seat, opened her notes, again began typing everything she could remember. Every small detail, every strange moment since boarding the stair, the refusal, the route, the message, the pilot's name, the locked cockpit. Every second mattered now. And then her phone buzzed again, another blocked message. "You never outrun what your father did." She inhaled sharply, stared at the words, then read them again, slower, colder, as if decoding the meaning. "Not what you did, not who you are, but what your father did." Someone was holding a grudge, not against her directly, but against the man who raised her, and that made the air even heavier, because it meant she was never the real target, she was the bait. She rose again, this time walking toward the restroom at the front near the cockpit, but paused and leaned close to the small access panel beside the cockpit door. She remembered her father teaching her how to read quick access points during his briefings when she was younger. The emergency protocol code wasn't visible, but she tried pressing a sequence anyway. Nothing responded, and that terrified her more than anything. Because if the override wasn't working, then the pilot had locked the crew out completely. The co-pilot stepped out again for a moment, and she caught his eye. He moved closer, whispered, "He's not listening to me. He keeps repeating something under his breath, something about making things right, about judgment, about finally ending what she asked." But he looked away, unable or unwilling to answer. Reverie returned to her seat, now fully alert, every instinct on fire. She sent a final text to her father before the signal could vanish. Again she included coordinates, time, and the quote from the pilot, and then turned to the woman beside her and said, "If something happens, I need you to tell them I tried to warn them, okay? Please just remember this." The woman nodded slowly, her face pale but strong. "I will," she whispered. "Whatever this is, we'll get through it." Then, without warning, the aircraft jolted, not violently but enough for the oxygen masks to rattle, slightly enough to send a ripple of fear through the passengers. Amira held onto the armrest, looked out the window, saw only blackness, and realized they had dropped in altitude just enough to bypass certain air control zones. Another trick she had learned from her father, another way pilots could hide if they wanted to. The speaker crackled again, and this time the pilot spoke slowly, deliberately. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing minor technical issues. Please remain calm and seated until further notice, and do not be alarmed." The tone chilled her. It was too calm to rehearsed, like someone reading a script written by rage and loss, and something buried deep within the folds of memory. And then her phone vibrated again, this time a voice message from an unknown source. She hesitated, then played it quietly under her hoodie, and what she heard made her blood freeze. It was a recording of her father's voice, but twisted, distorted, like it had been spliced together, saying things he never said. "You'll pay for what I've done. I made enemies, and now she'll suffer for it." Amira's hands trembled as she hit stop. The message was fake, an edit, some kind of scare tactic, but the fact someone had the resources to do this while in the air, while in flight, meant that this wasn't just a rogue pilot. It was something coordinated, something fueled by obsession and malice, and a long memory. She ran again to the back, told the flight attendant about the voice message. The woman paled and said, "I don't think he's acting alone anymore. I think someone helped him get control of the flight plan, someone on the ground. This isn't just an act of hate, this is an act of revenge." Amira said, her throat tightening for what the woman glanced around, leaned in, and whispered, "I don't think your father just put people in jail. I think he buried someone close to him." Amira felt the words like glass in her chest. Her father had warned her that his enemies were never just criminals, they were people who smiled, who waited, who watched, and now someone was finally making their move by taking the one thing he could never replace her. The flight attendant said, "We're going to try one more thing to send an emergency ping from the cabin Wi-Fi system. It's weak, but if we boost the signal with passenger devices, we might reach a satellite long enough to trigger the FBI backup." So Amira ran seat to seat, gathering phones, explaining quickly, asking passengers to activate airplane mode Wi-Fi hotspot. She collected 20 devices, gave them to the crew who assembled them near the cabin hub, and then prayed as they transmitted a surge of raw data into the night sky. For one moment the plane felt united, everyone silent, watching their screens, hoping for a reply. Then suddenly, Amira's phone buzzed again. A message flashed across the screen. "Ping received, aircraft identified, flight scrambled. Response estimated time 12 minutes. Stay calm and stay seated." She showed it to the crew, who stared in awe. "It worked," one woman whispered. "It actually worked." But 12 minutes was a long time in the sky, and Amira knew it. They were flying in a metal box controlled by a man unraveling at the edge of sanity, with a grudge against the most powerful lawman in the country, and nothing left to lose. She sat back in her seat, heart pounding, sweat on her brow, whispering to herself, "Stay calm, stay smart, stay smart." Breathing, she stared at the cockpit door, and knew that if those 12 minutes didn't arrive fast enough, everything would depend on her and the pilot. He was no longer flying to land, he was flying to finish something personal. Countdown to impact. The moment the message confirmed, a response team was on its way. The cabin filled with a strange, tense silence, the kind where hope and fear battle in every breath. 12 minutes had never felt so long to Amira. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her fingertips, in her spine. The metal bird she was trapped in now felt colder, heavier, as if gravity itself had joined the conspiracy. She stared forward at the cockpit door, knowing beyond it sat a man unraveling by the second. A man who had locked the controls to a vessel filled with innocent lives, and was now steering it through airspace meant to remain unseen. She kept telling herself to breathe. Her father had trained her for pressure, survival, law, protocol, everything, but this wasn't something from his FBI briefings. This was personal, this was legacy, and whatever rage boiled inside that cockpit, it wasn't just about her. It was about a past that was never buried. It was about sins committed long ago that were now circling back with vengeance. Dressed in a pilot's uniform, the flight attendant came running down the aisle, her face pale and her eyes wide. She whispered to Amira, "The crew door camera just went dark. We can't see the cockpit anymore." The screen went black, like it was disabled. Amira swallowed hard. If he cut the feed, it means he doesn't want us to see what comes next. She stood, trembling but firm, then turned to the passengers. "We need everyone awake, alert, and ready for instructions." She shouted, "This is a security threat, and it's real. We are being intercepted in under 10 minutes. But we need to stay united and strong until then." The passengers stared wide-eyed. Some began crying quietly, others clutched their seats' phones buzzed with the emergency relay app, showing a flashing red warning. Some gasped, others prayed, and Amira stood tall, her voice steady like her father taught her to be. "When fear tries to choke you, you speak louder than it, and never blink." The co-pilot slipped out again, pale sweat covering his face. He whispered low, "We are losing altitude. He's manually overriding system protocols. He says it's a descent pattern. But I think he's lying. I think he's setting up a crash. I don't know if he wants to survive it or not. But his eyes are wrong, and he won't let me near the backup controls. I think he wants to end something in front of the world, or maybe Just in front of you. Amira's breath caught in her chest. This wasn't just a hijacking. This was a message, and she was the envelope. She asked the co-pilot. Do you know what happened between him and my father? The co-pilot hesitated, then nodded. I only heard rumors long ago, back when I was still training, but they say your father was responsible for a major case. That led to the shutdown of a covert flight operation, something hidden inside the agency. Some say it involved drug routes, others say it was political, but one name always came up, Riker, and word is your father testified against him. Had him removed dishonorably. They erased it from public record, but it cost your father friends and nearly his own badge, and it destroyed Amira closed her eyes and saw her father at the dinner table staring long into his tea, the weight in his eyes, the silence between his words. It all made sense. Now, he never told her because some enemies sleep deep until they wake, and some truths only bloom when blood is close to spilling. She asked, can we stop him? And the co-pilot shook his head. Not unless we open the door, which is impossible from outside. Once sealed, only the captain can unlock it, unless we use an axe or override from the cabin server. Do we have an axe? She asked. We have the emergency crowbar, but it would take 2 or 3 people and 5 minutes to even dent that door, and it's reinforced for impact. Amira nodded, then said, then we try the other way. She ran to the back, grabbed her phone. Her father had once shown her how the cabin server ran when accessed via maintenance mode, and if Riker missed disabling that, she had one chance left. She linked 10 passenger phones into a Wi-Fi grid, looped them through her device, and then typed a custom code sequence, a bypass command using a legacy pilot override protocol. It was a wild guess, a shot in the dark, and then the server blinked once, then again. Then she was in flight. Data blinked onto the screen: coordinates, descent, speed, cabin pressure, and then the command log from the cockpit, showing a set of manual overrides set to initiate full descent in 6 minutes. Amira's hands flew across the keys. She tried to reroute the code to trigger cabin lockdown, reset the altimeter auto override system, denied. The screen flashed access, restricted, overridden by Captain ID sheet. Tried again, this time using a nested command her father once taught her for when all else failed, a silent ping that bounced from the tail control to the nose gear systems, and then forced a loop restarts. The cabin lights flickered once the screens reset, and then a grinding noise filled the aircraft as the autopilot tried to take back control. The plane leveled for a brief second, just enough for the passengers to feel it, and hope sparked across the cabin like electricity, until the cockpit door slammed open, and Captain Riker stepped out, his eyes wild, his hands clenched, his uniform half torn as if he had been wrestling with ghosts. Inside that cockpit, he pointed directly at Amira, and shouted, you don't get to erase me like your father did. Not again. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants stepped back. Amira stood still, heart pounding, chest tight. Riker took a step forward, his voice breaking. You think justice lives in silence. You think your name protects you, but I was a man once. I was more than this, and he stole that from Memi. Father did his job, Amira said quietly, and he paid for it every day since, and now so will you. He hissed and reached for something inside his jacket, but before he could pull it, a passenger from behind tackled him to the ground. Another joined, then another, and soon 6 people pinned him down, shouting for restraints. The crew moved fast. Zip ties were pulled, his arms bound and his mouth gagged. Their co-pilot rushed into the cockpit, the override command still active. He took the seat, gripped the controls, and stabilized the aircraft once more, rerouting it toward a military base now pinging with emergency beacon lights. Amira stood in the aisle, shaking, staring down at the man who had nearly ended hundreds of lives. Just to send a message, he stared back, unblinking, and his eyes was no remorse, just an emptiness so cold it could freeze the sun. 10 minutes later, fighter jets flanked the aircraft, guiding it safely to descent. When the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted in tears and applause, but Amira just sat quietly watching the blinking lights outside, knowing this story was far from over, because legacies never die quietly, and justice always carries a cost. The past never stays buried. The plane sat still on the tarmac, surrounded by flashing lights and armed security, vehicles forming a circle of steel around it. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting streaks of fire across the clouds, as if the sky itself had witnessed everything that had unfolded. Amira remained in her seat, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the sheer weight of survival. Passengers were being escorted out row by row, some still weeping, others stunned into silence. The once cold and suspicious faces had turned to ones of quiet admiration and whispered gratitude. But none of that mattered now, because the real storm was only just beginning. Federal agents swarmed the aircraft. As the jet bridge was extended, they entered with clinical precision. Weapons drawn but not fired. The pilot, Captain Riker, was dragged. Outbound eyes staring at nothing, lips still mumbling words. No one could fully understand. The passengers watched as he was carried away. But Amira saw something more. She saw the shadow that had been hiding behind his eyes. Something twisted, broken, shaped by a grudge that had festered too long without light. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a direct line, a call from her father. She answered with shaking fingers. "I saw the feed," he said, voice raw. "I saw everything you did, baby. You saved." Only Amira closed her eyes, the sound of his voice nearly undoing her composure. But she held on. "Not yet." "Dad," he said something. Before they tackled him, he said you stole his life, that this was about more than a job, more than protocol. "What did you do to him?" There was silence on the line, a silence that lasted long enough to make her wonder if he would answer at all. And then he spoke. "Years ago, there was a covert operation running under the radar. Pilots were smuggling unregistered cargo. Using federal resources, the higher-ups claimed it was surveillance, but what I found was darker: trafficking, data manipulation, false identities, disappearing people not by accident but on purpose. Riker was one of the best pilots they had, and one of the first. I investigated. I exposed the entire network through internal affairs, and my testimony ended the careers of 15 agents. Riker lost everything: his clearance, his pension, even his family blamed him. So he blamed you." Amira whispered. "He did more than blame me. He sent death threats, followed me for a year, tried to sue the bureau, and when nothing worked, he vanished. I thought he gave up, but I was wrong. He was just waiting." Amira's breath caught. "And he found me instead." "Yes," her father said, "and I'm sorry, more sorry than you'll ever know. I should have told you everything. I should have warned you better, but I thought if I left it buried, it would die with time. It never does," she said softly. Outside agents guided her down the stairs into a secure van. She was wrapped in a blanket, offered water, medical checks, but she waved it all off. Her mind was spinning with pieces that didn't yet fit. At the debriefing room, she sat alone until a woman in a sharp navy suit entered. She introduced herself as Agent Rivera, Internal Security Division, and placed a thick file on the table across from Amira. Her tone was respectful but firm. "We need your help," she said, "because what happened on that flight was not just an isolated event, it was the tip of something much deeper." Rivera leaned forward and said, "I'm listening." Rivera opened the file, revealing photographs of multiple pilots, agents, staff, all with similar records, similar complaints, hidden, buried, redacted, and she said quietly, "We believe there is still a network operating, one that survived the initial purge your father triggered, and Riker was in contact with someone during that flight. We picked up encrypted signals sent from the cockpit before the systems were disabled, and we're trying to decode them now, so he wasn't working alone." Amira asked. "We don't think so," Rivera replied. "We think he was trying to broadcast something, a final message or a signal to activate a second phase. We found a burner phone on him with traces of communication that don't match any known civilian or military frequency." "What does that mean?" Amira asked. "It means he might have been a messenger, not the mastermind," Rivera said. "And that puts you in danger still." Amira felt the words land heavy in her stomach. She had fought to survive this flight, not realizing it was only chapter 1 of a larger story, one that began before she was even born, one that now had her name written across its pages. "Can I see him?" she asked. Rivera hesitated, then nodded. They brought her to a holding cell where Captain Riker was strapped to a chair. Under sedation, 2 guards stood nearby, silent as statues. His eyes fluttered open when she entered, and for a moment they were clear. "Sane, even you look like him," he said, his voice dry like paper. "I thought you'd be weak." Kurumia stood her ground. "You nearly killed everyone on that plane because you couldn't let go of a grudge." "No," he replied. "I did it because he killed something inside me. He made me nothing, and then he moved on like I was just a file to be stamped and forgotten." "My father did his job," she said. "He didn't choose you, he chose the truth. Truth is a matter of power," he growled, "and yours runs deep, too deep. Name your face, you'll carry the curse he left behind." "A curse," she said firmly, "a responsibility, and I won't run from it." Riker leaned back, smiling faintly, then said, "It's already started. They'll come for you. Not today, not tomorrow, but they will, because you scratched the surface, and now they know you're watching." Amira turned and left without another word, because she had heard enough, and because somewhere deep down She knew he wasn't lying. Later that night, after hours of questioning and forms and calls, Amira stood alone in the parking lot, breathing in the cold air, trying to feel normal again, but nothing felt normal anymore. She checked her phone, saw a message from her father. It simply said, "I'm proud of you and I'm sorry. I never told you the whole story." And for a moment, she smiled, not because the danger was over, but because she was no longer in the dark. She now carried light, and she was ready to shine it wherever shadows tried to hide what justice really means. The night was colder than usual in Washington, D.C. as Amira stepped out of the black SUV that brought her to the private FBI facility. The stars above seemed to flicker more urgently, as if the heavens themselves were anxious about what would unfold next. It had been 3 weeks since the flight, 3 weeks since she was pulled into a legacy of secrets, betrayal and pain, 3 weeks since she stared into the face of a man who hated her, not for who she was, but for what her bloodline represented. And in that time, everything had changed, not just for her, but for the system that had tried to bury its infancy. She walked into the building, greeted by 2 agents who nodded respectfully. They no longer saw her as just the daughter of someone powerful. They saw her as someone who had earned her own weight in this war. They led her down a quiet corridor to a chamber where a long table stretched across the floor, lined with screens, documents, surveillance images, names and faces she didn't recognize, and some she did too. Well, Rivera stood at the head of the table, her expression firm, her voice calm as she welcomed Amira and explained what had been uncovered through the encrypted cockpit signals. They had traced a web of dormant accounts, shadow operations, and ghost flights routes that were never meant to be tracked, names that hadn't appeared on payrolls in over a decade, and worst of all, a directive buried so deep it was practically legend, something called protocol. Amira listened carefully, her fingers gripping the chair edge, as Rivera explained that protocol. ECHO was a contingency plan meant to activate if internal agents were ever exposed or compromised, a silent network trained to disrupt public confidence, target key witnesses, and destabilize investigations through quiet means. Plane malfunctions, smear campaigns, disappearances, and more. It had never been used officially until now. And Riker, she asked. He was the first to wake it, Rivera said, and maybe not the last. We believe he tried to activate the rest, but your actions disrupted the chain. His final broadcast was incomplete, but it still triggered minor anomalies. Across 3 other cities we believe sleeper agents might be active, and you, Amira, are the only person who has now seen how they operate from the inside. Amira leaned back, staring at the maps and strings and faces. She never imagined her life would end up like this. She had been a student, a barista, a daughter trying to reconnect with her father. Now she was a name in a file marked priority. Now she was evidence that truth can survive, even when surrounded by lies. "What do you want from me?" she asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it aloud. Rivera didn't hesitate. "We want you to train, to work with us, to help identify the patterns, to be part of something that fixes what broke before you were born. We want your fire, your mind, your story." Amira thought about it for a long, quiet moment, then nodded, not because she wanted revenge, but because she had seen what silence cost, and she had no interest in paying that price again. Over the next month, Amira entered a world she had once only glimpsed through her father's late-night calls and careful warnings. She learned surveillance, counterintelligence, history buried under red tape, and loyalty. She trained with field agents, endured mental simulations, physical drills, and strategic debriefs. She bled through it all, but never once backed down. And then one day a case came across her desk, a private flight manifest recently altered, unusual cargo on board, destination rerouted mid-air, and pilot credentials flagged as inactive. It was subtle, almost invisible, but not to her, not anymore. She handed the file to Rivera and said, "They're testing the network again, looking for weak spots." Rivera stared at the data, then nodded. "You curious?" Amira said, "Because I know the patterns now, and they're afraid of what I know." Later that evening she returned to her small apartment and found a letter waiting inside the mailbox. No stamp, no sender, just her name handwritten. She opened it slowly, and inside was a single photograph of Captain Riker as a young man in uniform standing beside another pilot whose face had been burned away, and on the back written in faded ink, "Not everyone you trust is who they say they are." Her hand shook slightly, but she placed the photo inside a folder marked "Unknown Threat" and stored it carefully. She was no longer surprised by these shadows, because she had become someone they now feared. That night, she sat under her desk lamp writing a letter to her father. She didn't need to send it, she just needed to say the words, "Dad, I forgive you," not for the silence, but for carrying it alone. "I understand now what you were protecting me from, and I promise I won't let your battles die unfinished. I'll walk where you walked, I'll fix what broke, and I'll carry your fire, not as a burden but as a torch." She folded the page, placed it beside her bed, and finally allowed herself to sleep for the first time in weeks outside. The city lights flickered like stars, fighting back the darkness, and deep beneath the streets files were being opened, eyes were watching, and a new name had just been added to the list of people they feared most: Amira Thomas, the daughter of the man they tried to erase, the girl who refused to be silent, and the woman who now hunted those who hid behind old lies. The end.